to this research project and to doing historical research in general, I think. So yeah, my name's Doug Brown. I'm at Kingston University. I'm a lecturer in geographic information systems and human geography, and I specialize in historical geography. So basically what that means is I'm very into digital mapping. So geographic information systems is just a longer way of saying digital mapping, and doing that on the past, so historical geography. So that means that I use old data sets, including old maps, but I also create new data sets or use new data sets that encapsulate data about the past. And you'll be familiar with that if you've been transcribing for us, because you've been transcribing, for instance, the index of pensioners that whose lives we're interested in. And that includes place names, so that includes geographic data. So that means that we can do lots of interesting things with geographic data. We can do geography on the past, as it were. So yeah, as you know, this is part of the Addressing Health project, which is funded by Wellcome and includes King's College London, Kingston, where I am, Derby, UCL, the Postal Museum, and U3A indeed. So as part of this project, we started off some years ago now, doing a kind of pilot study, just an initial study. We used sample data from, oops, I've been muted. Wasn't me, I swear. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, great. Fab. Sorry about that. So yeah, we were using a sample of data, and that sample was about 1,200 individuals. We took information about pensioners from the Postal Museum's pensions records, the letters to the Treasury, and we just picked a few years. We picked census years, 1861, 71, 81, and 91, just to see what kind of data was available and what we could do with that data, whether it was worth doing a bigger project, essentially. And we discovered all sorts of interesting things from that convinced us that it was really important to do this bigger project, which is going to include potentially about 25,000 postal pensioners. So it's a big jump from 1,200 to 25,000. So we thought it would be worth just checking that there was something interesting in there. So what we found was lots of differences in spatial data. So I'm starting with a not very exciting chart, I suppose, but this kind of summarizes the differences between different sorts of places and the outcomes for the pensioners that we found just in that sample. So of those 1,215, I think it was, only some of them were sort of retired as such. Some people were made redundant, some people died, so we excluded a few people. So out of 1,170 in our first sample, you can see this chart is showing the percentage of those people in different places who retired either with ill health or because they had reached retirement age. They'd either reached 60 or 65, depending on what the retirement age was at the time. So if you reached the superannuation age, then you had retired of old age, as they put it. And if you retired of basically some disease, some kind of ill health condition, then that was recorded. So we looked at this sample and we saw that there was this incredible difference, that in rural areas and towns, which we classified as places under 10,000 population, and between 10,000 and 100,000 population, those were rural and town. And then urban we classified as anything over 100,000 population, with the exception of London, which we made its own category because it accounted for such a large proportion of the data in total. And we could see that rural and town, basically areas whose population was under about 100,000, exhibited very similar characteristics. About 50% of people in rural areas and towns reached superannuation age and half retired because of ill health. But if you look in London, you can see that over 70% of the people who were awarded a pension in those sample years was awarded a pension because of ill health. So very few people were actually making it to retirement age in London. So we thought, well, that's something really interesting. Here is the importance of place for our research. So all of our research in the wider project is going to have to ask lots of questions about geography, about the importance of place and why. And we've got a few different reasons for thinking about this, and a few different, I suppose, hypotheses for why things might be different in different places. I mean, it's easy to say, well, London's unhealthy and rural areas are healthy, but why? What's going on there? And there are a few different things. One is the working environment, and one is the living environment. So just looking at working environments, just a few little examples of little snippets of things that kind of shed light on what's happening. We've got this image from the Illustrated London News on the left from 1845, showing Saturday night at the receiving office. It's a busy evening. We've got people basically lobbing their packets and newspapers and letters. Newspapers are going through the post at these poor chaps who have to stuff them into sacks and pass them over to the sorters. And you know, this is the beginning of a long process, but it's very manual labor. We've got to imagine that, you know, there's an entire night shift whose job it is just to drag very heavy sacks around, and it's very dusty, and it's not well lit. It's an unpleasant atmosphere. So in the second half of the 19th century in particular, especially after the introduction of gas lighting, it was very dusty, it was very fumy, lots of noxious gas fumes from the gas lights, lots of heavy lifting, split shifts in London especially, and people would work for 4 hours in the morning, 4 hours in the evening, but very often they were commuting. They weren't living right next to their job, as they might be in a smaller town. For instance, they might be living within easy walking distance. If you're living in London and you've got to get the omnibus or the tube or whatever, you know, you don't have time to go home in the middle of your, you know, after your first shift. So a lot of people are lacking sleep. Maybe they're going to the pub in the middle of the day between their shifts. Of course, this was very strongly frowned on by the authorities, but very difficult to control. It was very stressful working split shifts. It was also very stressful working in a very high pressured environment. There were millions, literally millions of items of post passing through the General Post Office. The telegraph machine, so telegraphists who were working with the telegraph machine were very prone to stress-related conditions. We see lots of mental health conditions cropping up with the telegraphists, and also a kind of repetitive strain injury that you might have heard of called telegraphist's cramp at the time. It was overcrowded, so if you were working very close proximity to other people, you had issues with social distancing, especially during the various waves of flu epidemics. So in the 1890s, for instance, the Russian flu. It was very hot, it was very stuffy. You can imagine that it was a really unpleasant place to work in. Of course, if you're working in rural areas, there are a whole different set of problems. You were working very hard, carrying very heavy loads. You were exposed to the weather. There were lots of accidents in rural areas, especially compared to, well, we have to do some more work on the differences between rural and urban in terms of the type and number of accidents, but we think rural areas, they did have quite a lot of accidents as well. And yeah, very heavy loads. So you had to be able to carry about 28 pounds when you set off on your round if you were delivering the post in rural areas. So if you can imagine wearing heavy greatcoat because it's pouring with rain, it's very cold, you're carrying a 12-kilo sack as you start off. It's going to have an effect on your joints. It's going to have an effect on your limbs. Lots of people retired because of bunions, because of joint problems, and so on. And a little snippet in the middle, something that we found in one of the documents we were looking at in the Postal Museum, that someone in Arbroath, the postmaster of Arbroath, was allowed to employ an assistant at 14 shillings a week out of his own allowance, because he had to go sick because he caught a chill while working on duty at the counter. So clearly that's not confined to just Arbroath, but I can imagine it was quite chilly conditions for lots of people all over the British Isles. And this quote from Sir Benjamin Ward Richardson in 1890, who was talking about the lot of the postman. The work of a postman is one of continuous busy go round. He's on his feet during the whole of his working hours. The result is that the postman wears out fast. So there's something about the nature of the work that is generating the sorts of health conditions that we see in lots of places. But there's also something about the living environments in general. It's not confined just to the nature of work. People spend, about a third of their time, let's say, at work, but they also spend the rest of their time in their living environments, and that might include their home or their or local surroundings. Two very famous images which you might have seen before, both of which are from Punch from the 1850s. The one on the left, I don't know if you can read this or how well you can see it, but this is titled "A Court for King Cholera," and it's referring to the extremely overcrowded and very unpleasant housing conditions that people were subjected to in London, especially. So in the most deprived areas, there were several families to one room in many lodging houses. And you can see, I don't know how well you can see this, but down at the front there are children playing with a dead rat. There are scrabbling around in dung heaps, all sorts of unpleasantness the more you look at this image. On the right is an image of Father Thames introducing his offspring to the fair city of London, a design for a fresco in the new Houses of Parliament in the 1850s. And we're talking about the era of the Great Stink, where the Thames was so polluted that Parliament moved temporarily because it was so disgusting. And the offspring of Father Thames, I don't know if you can read this, are diphtheria, scrofula, and cholera. So there was a lot of concern. It wasn't it wasn't a great unknown. People knew very well that the polluted water and poor housing and lack of fresh air and sunlight and airborne pollution were all contributing to poor health, especially in London. So we think that there's something about living conditions, even if postal workers were relatively well paid and had relatively decent living conditions, they were still going to be very near to people who were living in terrible conditions and often in overcrowded conditions. And we all know that if, for instance, even now, if you go on the tube, you're going to be next to people who you might catch something from, and that was even before COVID appeared. So living in somewhere like London, even if you yourself are not living in a room with several other families, you are likely to be exposed to this wider sort of contagious atmosphere. So issues with working environments, issues with living environments. So we can have a little bit of a closer look at this just using the sample data that we've got so far. This chart shows you the bottom line is showing the age of recruitment, the average age of recruitment. The top line is showing on these bars the average age of retirement. And in London and urban areas, people started work in the post office at an earlier age, in their mid-20s, than in towns and rural areas. In rural areas, people tended to start, on average, the starting age for working in the post office was in the mid-30s. So they had jobs beforehand. It was something that you wouldn't do in a rural area as by and large as a young boy. In London, we're talking mean ages, average ages. So in London, we had lots of boy messengers, so teenagers as well. And so there's something about the age profiles in different places, which means that people are going to be getting different sorts of conditions. Things like mental health problems and consumption, tuberculosis, are diseases that are often associated with the early mid-20s. This happens much earlier. So you see a lot less of the mental health conditions and the and consumption in rural areas just because of those ages. Now, people tend to have about the same period, tend to have about 20-ish, 22 years on average of working for the post office in them. It's just that if you start earlier, you're going to be retiring earlier. But you would expect, nonetheless, that you would have, an entire working life ahead of you. People are retiring in London, and then everybody tends to, on average, have about 10 years before death, it seems, according to our sample data. So we've got still more work to do there. So there's interesting differences in places. I'll just show you this very briefly. You can see that these ages in retirements, these histograms, basically the distribution of the frequency of these ages. So if you look at the bottom one, looking at the rural areas, you can see that most people are retiring in their 60s, which is to be expected. Whereas if you look at the urban and London places at the top, so urban, you get a bit of a peak in the 20s and then again in the 60s. But in London, it's a much smoother line. It's, there isn't this peak in the 60s. There's a bit of a peak, but it's a lot more uniform even at younger ages. So there's something about London, something about the importance of geography here. And we can map these percentages of people who retired in these places with different sorts of conditions. So we can see that cities are very, so the cities are labeled, rural areas are not labeled. The cities are very poor for mental health, relatively high proportions of people who are retiring because of mental health issues, but not in every city. Manchester and Liverpool, right next to each other. Manchester, a high proportion of people retiring because of mental health issues. Liverpool, relatively small area. So there's a big question there. What's the difference? And with our sample data, we don't have enough to find out, which is why it's important that we get the full data set. Similarly, tuberculosis, Glasgow, lots of people retiring because of tuberculosis. Edinburgh, not so many. Birmingham, not so many. London, not so many, but Manchester and Liverpool, quite a lot. So, and indeed Dublin. So some cities are more prone to having high rates of tuberculosis than others. So interesting to see what's happening there. This all means that we need loads more data, because with only 1,000 odd individuals, we can't slice them up so to speak. We can't slice the data set up according to lots of different regions and according to lots of different characteristics in the way that we'd like. So with 25,000 odd individuals, we'll be able to do that in a lot more depth. We'll be able to ask more questions about where did post office employees live and work, and what features of working life varied according to different sorts of places. There are lots of different things that we can ask about this. So these points on this map, these dots, are all showing where individuals who have been transcribed from the index. So thank you to everybody who's been involved in that. All of these individuals, we've got about 8,000 of them shown on this map. So some of the dots are on top of each other. So there are a few hundred in London, for instance, but they're all quite tightly clustered, so you can't make them out that easily. So each of these points represents at least one person who's retired, and we can look at where they are, what sorts of conditions they had, and start to ask questions about how all of these different living and working conditions changed over time, and how this was reflected in causes of retirement and the numbers of days off sick they had while they were working. Because all of this information is recorded in the Postal Museum's archives, which we're transcribing. We can also ask questions about women which we couldn't ask using the sample data set, because with only 1,000 or so individuals, quite a small proportion of these were women, and they tended to be in the later years, the 1880s and 1890s, had lots more women in the workforce than in the 1860s and 70s. And we can see that although places like London had a high proportion of, I haven't pulled out London specifically here actually, but had a relatively high proportion of women working as part of the workforce, especially in telegraphy, but in doing other things too, that it tends to be, the darker the colour, the more women were retiring. This is just retirements, this isn't total workforce, this is just retirements, because this is just showing the index. But we can see that in some places, over a quarter of the people who were retiring from the post office were women, especially in Ireland and in Scotland. So it looks like more rural areas had lots more women working in them, and you'll you'll remember if you were at David's talk, the last talk about the elderly postmistresses of the UK, that there's this kind of stereotype of women working in as postmistresses and sub-postmistresses, but we can see that there are lots of women working for the post office in all across the country. So something that we can do with that information is ask lots more questions about what women's working lives were like that we couldn't ask before, and this is going to be very new, very interesting. So we start off with the raw data that you provide. We've got the just a little kind of example of what the index has been able to tell us, and we get that data. We start off with this raw data in a spreadsheet, and then we can match the places that are in the index with the place names in a historic gazetteer. So we've got a list of places in the historic gazetteer. How he did this work, and that gives us the latitude and the longitude. And with that information, we can plot these individuals. So with the latitude and longitude, we put it into a geographic information system. So we just put it into mapping software, and we end up with these points. And then there are lots of other things that we can do with that. So we can add, for instance, the historic boundaries of counties, but it doesn't have to be. We could do it with poor law unions. We could do it with regions. We could do it with countries. We could do it with registration districts and sub-registration districts. All of these sorts of different geographies are all available, but just as an example, here are the counties, historic counties as they were at the time. And you just lay one on top of the other, and then you can ask the software to tell you how many points are in each of these polygons, how many individuals are in this county or that county, what's the population of that country, of that county overall, what proportion of the population would you expect to see retiring with particular conditions, and so on. You can compare all of those different things. So the software will let us answer all of those questions. So that's what some of the work that I've been doing on this is all about. And then the exciting bit for me is when we can overlay some of that information on the historic maps. So here's an example using we've got an old map. We've got a couple of people who retired relatively close to each other, but a few years apart, a couple of decades out. So Thomas Gardner, a sub-postmaster who retired from St Ninian's post office in 1882. We've got James Woolston, who retired as a messenger in 1865. So there's two examples of 2 points chosen relatively randomly because they were close together and would fit on one map. So St Ninian's and Bannockburn, just south of Stirling, as it was. We can use this, use these maps, these old maps, to tell us something interesting about the local area. We can see what kind of conditions these people were in. So at the time, they were working in relatively rural areas. These are quite small, small village, small-ish settlement, not tiny. There are smaller villages. They're not hamlets. There's traffic going through, and they're relatively near a big town. They're relatively near Stirling. But we can go and look at what St Ninian's was like in a bit more detail. We've got the Ordnance Survey map from the 1860s. I think it's the 1860s, possibly early 1870s. This is the county series. And so I think this is the 6 inch to the mile. I don't think it's 25 inch. That's one of the issues with these old maps. You get them from these various data sources. You don't always know exactly what the original published scale was, but you can what's called geo-reference them, so you can make them fit into the real world with a bit of tweaking. Anyway, in the 1860s, we can see where the post office was. PO, as you probably know, indicates the post office of St Ninian's. But then if we look at the 1890s, the 25 inch survey, you can see the post office is actually marked a few doors down. So whether there was an error or whether the post office actually moved, why did it move? Was it because the post office moved when different individuals were the postmaster or the postmistress of the place, and it was just their home? And so did the post office move when you had different personnel because they were living in different places to before? Or did it have to move because somebody wanted to move premises, and that was what happened? So that's something that will be interesting to find out about. Not that it's absolutely vital to understanding the wider context. But these are the sorts of questions that immediately arise when I start looking at old maps. You know, why did the post office move in those years? So maybe it's just me, but I get a little bit caught up in this kind of thing. And then, of course, you want to get on Google Street View and start looking at all of these places, and then you can find out why there's just a belfry and a church in ruins in St Ninians. And it turns out that during the Jacobite rebellion, the church was used as a munitions store and was blown up. It's totally not relevant to the post office, but these are the sorts of things you start looking at when you start looking at these old maps. Okay, so something else you can do is see what the area is like now. If you use the National Library of Scotland, I hope this is working for you. I can see this, see some nods. That's great. So you can look at what St Ninians and Bannockburn towns look like now, and of course they're suburbs of Stirling. They're not their own areas anymore, but you can see that they can see the development over time. And if you start comparing lots of different maps and intervening period, you can see gradually how these towns are getting more populated, and you can think about what sorts of social changes are happening in these towns over the period, and what sorts of differences would the post office be seeing. You know, the post office in St Ninians and the post office in Bannockburn would be seeing enormous increases in the volume of letters that were coming through, and this reflects something about wider social change as well. Something else that's quite fun is that you can see lots of the features remain the same using the modern satellite imagery. Lots of field boundaries are often in the same places. So if you look on the top right, you'll see some of the field boundaries stay the same. Yeah, so I could spend far too long on this, and I'm aware that time is moving on, so I'm going to move on. You can do the same with Ireland. So the National Library of Scotland's website has got loads of maps for England, Wales, and Scotland. But if you want to do something similar for Ireland, then you use the OSI website. There, I'll share links later on. You can do something similar. Here we've got, I thought I'd look at what's the most westerly of our retirees in this index. So I chose Clifton in Galway. That's the most westerly that's in this data set. And that was Catherine Thomas, who was a sub-postmistress and retired in 1869. From what I could find out with, you know, just a little bit of research, nothing in much depth, I know that she was operating the post office from at least 1837. So she had a good 30 years working in this town, and died in 1876, age 76. So she was about 37 when she started, at least possibly younger when she started working in the post office. And she was operating the post office from what is now the Sea Mist bed and breakfast. You can see it's on this map where I've circled it next to what's labelled National Bank. That building is still the Bank of Ireland, and you can see that it's this beautiful looking building, actually, with the angled front that's indicated to the left of the National Bank. Just to the right of it, on the corner of Market Street on the map, there's another post office labelled. It's labelled post office, but that wasn't the post office until the 1890s. This map is the earliest map that I could find, and it's from the 1890s. There are earlier maps, but they don't show the buildings in as much detail. So I thought this was quite a good one. But Clifton in Galway was a new town in the 1830s. It was only founded in 1810s or early 20s by a chap called John Darcy, who was the local landowner and thought a town would be a good thing to have about here. And it grew over the course of the 19th century. But when Catherine Thomas started out in Clifton, it was probably brand new. So it's quite fun to have a look around there. Anyway, this image on the top right is, in the center top of the Sea Mist house is from Google Maps. So Google Street View, lots of fun to be had traveling around, comparing what places were like in the 19th century according to the OS maps and comparing them with what they look like now, and trying to identify whether buildings have been replaced or just refaced. Okay, I thought I would just say something a little about the Ordnance Survey. I'm not an expert on Ordnance Survey at all, so I like using old maps and I like working with spatial data, but working with spatial data is the thing that I do more than sort of understanding the history of Ordnance Survey. So I suspect there are probably people that I'm talking to right now who know an awful lot more about Ordnance Survey than I do. So apologies if that's you. But we usually think of Ordnance Survey as being founded in 1791, but it had a longer history. Its history was it started to be a thing, thinking about let's map the whole of the country after the Jacobite rebellion in 1745, and the creation of what was called the Duke of Cumberland's map. He was the sponsor, he was the minister, but it largely fell down to a chap called Watson and someone who worked for him called William Roy. And Roy's name is associated with the maps of Scotland from that period, and indeed England. And the other thing that in the 18th century that also kind of fed into this was the London-Paris triangulation, which was completed by 1790. They wanted to work out exactly how far away London and Paris were, and so there was a great surveying exercise that was done to do that, and that was followed by surveying of the British Isles. And so these maps grew and grew. There were lots of reasons for mapping. Some of it was to kind of put down potential rebellions in Scotland, but part of it was felt to be an important thing to do, especially after the Napoleonic period. So there were lots of military reasons, and of course the name is reflected, it reflects that Ordnance Survey, of course, but lots of civil functions as well. And one of the big drivers for mapping the country was the movement for sanitation, trying to work out what is in each town, what should each town have in it, and where are all of these things. So it shows things like water sources, so that soldiers passing through a village might be able to locate the pump easily, but also it's got a wider thing about kind of understanding and gathering data about society and the country as a whole as a kind of movement towards modernity in a sense. Ordnance Survey is digitized 230,000 odd sheets of its old maps, and these are kind of static maps that you can't really interact with. They're kind of base maps, but they also have lots of online interactive products that you can use as well as paper maps nowadays. So just a very quick look at Roy's military survey of Scotland. This is what Glasgow looked like according to the Roy map, the Duke of Cumberland's map, in about 1750. You might, if you're familiar with Glasgow, you'll recognise Anderson over here. You've got Gorbals south of the river, Govan over here. I don't know if you can see my mouse moving, but this is Glasgow as it was, and it's showing that lots of these areas that are now very built up, as you can see here. Obviously Glasgow is another very good example of urbanization over the period, but Glasgow is, a town. I mean, it was a city, but it was a decent sized settlement. But lots of the places that we now think of as just being areas of Glasgow, even central areas of Glasgow, let alone Greater Glasgow, are villages or farms. And the interesting thing for me is how many of the farm names still exist as place names or street names in the modern era. So, for instance, over here, kind of center top left-ish, we've got what's spelt as Partick, it's a Partick, and Byres, and Byres Road, of course, this sort of area is running down here. We've got the River Kelvin, of course. This is all part of the University District over here, Hindland, and so on. So these are all small villages or small settlements or just even farms that are present today. So you can follow the development of places by looking through these different Ordnance Survey products. I thought it might also be just to finish off, think about this idea about what a map actually is, and just to kind of throw a spanner in the works a little bit, I suppose. We think of maps as being kind of authoritative sources of the truth about something in many cases. As Harley suggests in his classic work, Deconstructing the Map, We often tend to work from the premise that mappers engage in an unquestionably scientific or objective form of knowledge creation. Of course, cartographers believe they have to say this to remain credible, but historians do not have that obligation, which is a source of comfort to me. So the steps in making a map: selection, omission, simplification, classification, the creation of hierarchies and symbolization, are all inherently rhetorical. So what he's saying is that just as somebody writes a piece of text with rhetorical devices in mind, the selection of words, putting them in particular orders, trying to make a point, maps do exactly the same thing. So it could be as obvious as Roy's map trying to kind of impose London government on what then was called North Britain, in that kind of direct, really obvious kind of power relation. But it can be a more subtle thing. Just the fact of having the Ordnance Survey at all, look at what's being shown on the map, tells us what successive governments or government agencies or society in general think are important things to put on a map. And it's a certain set of things, and it doesn't tell you an awful lot about very many other things. And different maps, of course, will have different selections of things, and we have to think about what does it mean that those things, those features have been selected for showing us, and the way that they've been symbolized as well. As Alfred Korzybski said, the map is not the territory. So with that, just a list of some of the sources where you can get some free mapping from. I haven't included the sorts of data that you would have to download and use specialist software for. All this will be distributed, so you're welcome to take screenshots or jot it down, but I'll send this around so you can click on the links instead of having to type them out manually, if that would be helpful. So I hope that was interesting and useful, telling you a little bit about what we've been doing with the data that you've been gathering and how we map it and why place is important to us on the Addressing Health project.